It seems like most videos on modes sort of break down modes in a way that is teaching you the theory of the thing without actually teaching you, okay, but how do I actually apply that realistically to my songwriting? So in this video, we're going to break down keys versus modes, what modes really are, and I think the easiest way to think of them and utilize them as songwriters. All right, so first let's cover what is really the difference between a key and a mode. I think the easiest way to think of it is if we have essentially two keys, major and minor. We're going to ignore natural minor and harmonic minor and all that specific subsets of minor for a second. We'll just say we have major and minor. So that's essentially like being able to paint in black and white. You certainly can do some great paintings in black and white. Black and white photography can be great, but you essentially have two different colors to paint with. But when it comes to modes, we're essentially adding more paint colors to our palette. And getting more specific, we have exactly 5 more colors to paint with if we're talking about major modes, which is the most useful modes and the modes that are going to be most important for you to understand as a songwriter. So there are a bunch of different ways to understand modes and look at modes that can be really helpful, but I want to keep this as short as possible and as useful as possible for songwriters, how to practically utilize modes. A great way to think of modes is really just as an alteration on your basic major key or minor key. The tendency is whenever you take a key, let's say a major key, and you add a sharp to it, your mode adds a sharp to it, it tends to sound brighter. And when you add a flat to a key, then it tends to sound darker. For instance, you could see the minor key, the natural minor key, as a major key, but you have a flattened 3rd, 6th, and 7th. So it is a more dark sounding major key. Obviously, we don't think of it that way, we just think of it as a minor key, but that's a tendency to understand going into this. That being said, there is one mode that is brighter or more sharp than major, and that is the Lydian Mode. The easiest way to think of the Lydian Mode is it's just your major key, but you have a sharp 4. What do we mean by sharp 4? Well, let's take C major as an example. In C major, we just have the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, all the white keys on a keyboard, all the natural notes, no sharps or flats, however you want to look at it. But a sharp 4 just means we take the 4th scale degree, which would be C, D, E, F, and then we sharpen it, or go up by 1 semitone. So while C major is just all the white keys, no sharps or flats, for C Lydian, we just take C, D, E, F sharp instead of F natural, and then G, A, B. If you wanted to do it in G major, you would have G, A, B, and the 4th is the C. Normally in G major, you'd have a C natural, so we make it C sharp, and then it becomes G Lydian. Now the next mode is the Ionian Mode, which is literally just the mode version of major. C major and C Ionian is the same thing. A major and A Ionian is the same thing. That's all you need to know about that, and honestly you don't even need to know that because nobody's ever going to say, oh, this is in C Ionian. They're going to say it's in C major. So next mode to understand is the Mixolydian Mode, which is just a major key but with a flat 7. Going back to C major, we had C, D, E, F, G, A, and it was going to be a B natural, but we're flattening the 7th, so we would actually have a B flat. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B flat to have C Mixolydian rather than C major, which would have a B natural instead of a B flat. Because again, Mixolydian is just major, but flatten the 7th scale degree. Next we have the Dorian Mode, which is essentially the brightest of the minor modes, because essentially we have 3 major modes and 3 minor modes, and then a diminished mode. And what I mean by that is sort of the same thing we mean by a major key and a minor key. In a major key, your 1 chord is major. In a minor key, your 1 chord is minor. So in both C major and C Lydian and C Mixolydian, the 1 chord is a major chord. So it's a major mode. But Dorian, the 1 chord, is actually going to be a minor chord. That being said, the 2 easiest ways to think of a Dorian mode could be that it is just a major key but with a flat 7 and a flat 3, but more likely the easiest way to look at Dorian Mode is essentially that it is a natural minor, but you actually sharpen the 6th scale degree. So if we take C minor, we would have C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. But because we are sharpening the 6th to get to Dorian, we would actually have C, D, E flat, F, G, and then we're getting to the 6th and we're sharpening it. So we would actually have A natural instead of A flat, and then B flat. That's all Dorian is. Next is Aeolian, which is kind of the same as Ionian in the sense that Aeolian is just minor, but the mode version of it. So A Aeolian would be the same as A minor. C Aeolian would be the same as C minor. So you really don't even need to know this because nobody's ever going to say, hey, this song is in C Aeolian. They're going to just say it's in C natural minor. So the next mode is the Phrygian mode, which is probably my favorite mode and the one with maybe the coolest name, if not maybe second coolest name. But regardless, this is just natural minor, but with a flat 2. So if we wanted to figure out C Phrygian, we would take C minor and then flatten the 2. So normally in C natural minor, we would have C and then D as the 2. But because we're flattening the 2, we actually would have C and then D flat instead. You may recognize that as the sound of Jaws, which, yes, the sound of Jaws is essentially the sound of Phrygian. And then finally, we have the Locrian mode, which is maybe another contender for coolest name, but unfortunately, this mode is widely considered almost useless because it really never sounds very resolved. It doesn't sound as dark as it sounds like it would. You think, oh, it's even darker than Phrygian, which is darker than minor. Sort of. So honestly, this one probably doesn't matter. Hey, if you can get it to work, great, but most people think it's not very useful. But for the record, what it is natural minor with a flat 2, which we already had from Phrygian, but also with a flat 5. So for the record, the reason most people consider this unstable and not particularly usable is the 1 chord in the Locrian mode is actually a diminished chord, which is a very unstable sounding chord because, well, it has the dreaded tritone. If your 1 chord sounds this unresolved, usually it's kind of hard to deal with that, so it tends to not be that useful. But for the record, C Locrian would be C, and then D flat, and then E flat, and then F, and then G flat, and then A flat, and then B flat, until back to C. All right, so we talked about the easiest way to think of modes from a theory standpoint, specifically for songwriters, but now we have to talk about how do we actually apply it. Essentially, there are 3 ways. One is to write a whole song in a mode instead of a key, where instead of having a song that is in C major or C minor, you actually write an entire song that's in C Lydian. This is usually going to be on the more rare side. There are some modes that are used for this more often than not, but this is definitely a great way to utilize modes. Another, probably more common way to utilize modes is to slip into a mode for a song section. Maybe in your bridge, you go into C Lydian when you were in C major for the rest of your song, or perhaps you were in A minor for most of your song, and then in your bridge you actually slip into A Phrygian, making it even darker and more aggressive sounding. And then finally, and most simply, and maybe most usefully, you can do what's called a borrowed chord. A borrowed chord is whenever you borrow a chord that is from a parallel key or mode. What on earth is a parallel key or mode? If you don't know, there's something called a relative minor. There's C major and its relative minor is A minor. What that means is that A minor and C major share the same notes, but one is minor and one is major. The parallel minor for C major would just be C minor, because parallel means built on the same root note. If you have C major, the parallel Lydian mode would be C Lydian. If you're in C major, the parallel Phrygian mode would be C Phrygian. So it's just keeping that same root note, but you are changing the different notes after that root note, essentially. So we talked about how Lydian has a sharp 4 compared to major. Normally, in C major, we'd have a D minor chord because we would have D, F, and A. But we could borrow the F sharp, making it a D major chord from the Lydian mode. So even though we're in C major for the whole song, we can then borrow from the Lydian mode, the C Lydian mode specifically, our parallel mode, that D major chord. And then, you know, just go back into our normal C major, you know, we're just chilling. And then borrow that D major again, because we're having that F sharp that wouldn't normally be there. This is probably the most useful way to understand modes, is borrowing them when you need them. So maybe you're like, man, it'd be really nice in my song that's in C major to have a chord that just changes things up a little bit. So think about, okay, what can I borrow from a parallel key or mode? And in general, if you've been trying to add non-diatonic chords to your songs, which non-diatonic just means that it's a chord that contains notes that just aren't naturally occurring in the key. So any chord in C major that uses any note that is not C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, which are the notes that happen in C major naturally, any chord that utilizes any note that isn't one of those would be technically a non-diatonic chord. A borrowed chord is a great way to do this. And just as another hint, the easiest way to start is maybe borrowing from a mode that is either just a little bit higher or a little bit lower. So for instance, if you have C major, probably don't try to borrow from C Phrygian, because that is way darker, because you have major, and then you have Mixolydian, and then you have Dorian, and then you have minor, and then you have Phrygian. So it's a lot darker. It's a pretty big difference. So if you're in major, maybe try borrowing from Lydian, which is just a sharp 4. That's the only difference. Everything else is the same. So Lydian and major are pretty close to each other. Same with Mixolydian and major. Mixolydian is just major, but with a flat 7. Another thing to utilize is the parallel key. So this is essentially just major and minor. If you're in A minor, go all the way to A major and borrow something from that. If you are in A major, borrow something from A minor. These are going to be the easiest ways to use it. And just as a last thing to help with, like, okay, but all these modes, I don't know why I would want to borrow from them. The quick and easy way to understand different modes are essentially Lydian tends to sound a little bit more ethereal and brighter and almost has like a heavenly sound. It also is the sound of The Simpsons. And then we had Ionian, which is just major, so we don't really need to talk about that. There's Mixolydian, which tends to sound like just a less oppressively happy major. So if you kind of want something that is major but a little bit darker sounding, utilize Mixolydian, which has a major flat 7 chord. So if you have ever heard this sort of sound, that's the sound of Mixolydian. By the way, this tends to be utilized a lot in sort of the major key rock music back in the day, where they often would actually be in Mixolydian mode because it's just a little less bright and happy sounding. Then there's Dorian, which just sounds like not as sad minor. It technically is minor because your 1 chord is going to be minor. Because it has that sharpened 6th, it's not quite as minor, not quite as sad and heartbreaking sounding. Then we have Aeolian, which is just the same as natural minor, so we don't need to talk about that. Phrygian tends to sound like more aggressive minor. If you think of really hard rock music that sounds super aggressive, that's like, whenever you think of that sound, or the Jaws soundtrack, it just has that more aggressive sound because of the semitone difference between the 1 and the 2. So if you want to add some aggression and maybe have an angry sounding song instead of a sad song, if you go from minor to Phrygian, that will tend to go from more sad sounding to more angry sounding. Of course, this is broad strokes, right? Not all major key songs sound happy. In fact, most of the songs I write, I call it melancholy major, because technically I write it in a major key, but the way I write it is such that it's not that happy sounding. So of course, major asterisk on this, right? These are tendencies. Finally, Locrian, just probably don't use it. I don't think anybody even knows what it sounds like. It just sounds lost and unresolved and not as cool and dark as you would hope that it would sound. So probably just don't even bother with Locrian. All right, so that's modes for songwriters. Think about modes as alterations on your major and minor keys. Also think about utilizing them in the 3 main different contexts you would utilize them, which is writing a whole song in a mode instead of a key, or just having a section of your song sort of slip into a mode, probably a parallel mode, which again is a mode that's built on the same scale degree. C major, the parallel Lydian mode would be C Lydian, the parallel Phrygian mode would be C Phrygian, and then finally utilizing a borrowed chord, which is when you really just take 1 chord from a parallel key or mode and utilize that for as long as you're on that chord, and then you just go back to being in whatever the key you were originally in was. So maybe you're in C major and you're just minding your own business, and then you borrow that D major chord that you would have in C Lydian, and then you just go back to C major like it never even happened. It's just one chord that you just borrowed for a moment. It's a little surprise that you gave everybody. That's from the Lydian Mode, and then you're done. If you're confused at all by like, oh my goodness, we talked about keys. Joseph, you took for granted in this video that I know what major and minor keys are. I don't even really know that. How do I know what chords and notes that I have in keys? Like, should everybody know that D major is D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, back to D, and what the chords are that are built off of that? I make it very simple in my free keys cheat sheet. It breaks down every single key and tells you, here are the chords you have, and here are the notes that you have. That way you can write a melody in any key, you can improvise in any key, maybe write a guitar solo for your song in whatever key. Figure out if you're writing your song's chord progression, what chord progressions to utilize to be in that key. Makes it really, really simple. So be sure to check that out. Link below in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. And don't be afraid of modes. Go out and maybe just do a borrowed chord from a parallel mode in your next song. I'll talk to you in the next one.